I know we were doing a hand raise, which I really appreciate, and I'm sorry we didn't get a count on that, but if we want to go ahead and raise your hands if you've participated in an LJS event before. I can see some hands going up. Okay, we're at 10, 16. Thanks for raising your hands, everybody. All right. Numbers looks like they're settling somewhere around the 28, 29 mark, so that's great, out of 130, out of 125 attendees. If you want to go ahead and click that hand again, it'll go ahead and drop it down. And so we want to give everybody a chance. So how many of you have never attended an LJS event before? This would be your chance to raise your hand. So if you would go ahead and do that now, we'll get a count on that. Looks like we got 50, 60. Great, that's like we've got that number. Others might have dropped off waiting for the technical difficulties to resolve themselves. So welcome to the LJS, your first LJS event. So the second feature we want to introduce you to is actually our Q&A button. And so at any time during the webinar, we want you to ask questions. We don't want you to wait till the end. We will have some designated time at the end for you to ask questions, but asking questions throughout will give us a feel for how to make this really meet your needs. So Melissa's going to be tracking those questions and making sure that I'm getting a chance to answer them as best I can throughout. So we want to give you a chance to utilize your question and answer box on your menu right now. And the question we want to ask you is, what is it that you hope to get out of this webinar? So this is your chance to fill in and ask, tell us and share with us what you'd like to get out of this webinar. New tools for communication. Great. Anyone else? Give you a minute or two to just fill in. What did you come looking for this morning or this afternoon? New perspective on information. Honestly, a recharge and a remind of the concept that you so appreciated learning at USBC. Great. It's great to have you. Culture shift. Beautiful. Tips to help you communicate with others around challenging topics. Excellent. Later in the webinar, we're going to ask you for that more inclusive language. Beautiful. All right. Well, we've got a really good guidance. I think you've all come to the webinar that we're going to be focusing on. So I want to go ahead and bring our attention to our objectives. This is what we're hoping to get through at the end of the webinar. We want to understand how to shift frames of reference. We'll help you understand what is a frame of reference and then how to get out of it, how to think differently. And communicate across that difference. And so we're also going to learn how to communicate across difference and dominance. And difference is one element, but power is one that we often don't address when we're talking about when we're talking in the world of diversity and inclusion. And this is why our focus is on equity and on justice. We're also going to recognize how the same does not equal fair. These are not the same things. And we also want to explore why context matters when it comes to equity. And hopefully by the end, you'll feel energized and inspired to continue on your equity journey. So the framework that we're going to work today is developed by a social psychologist whose name is William Perry. He's no longer with us. But William Perry was a professor at Harvard University, and he developed this, what we call this scheme of cognitive and ethical development during his, out of some research that he did there. Now, I want to go ahead and share that all of these tools, we don't always have the opportunity to talk about emotions or power imbalances of power, but we're going to bring those in because I would say that wasn't central in Perry's model when he developed it. And he did develop this model while studying white men at Harvard. And so we want to also allow that there's probably a race, class, and gender bias in his research. Nevertheless, I'm not here to actually teach you Perry. I'm here to apply Perry to the context of cross-cultural communication. And so when we are applying these frameworks or this model to that context, we are going to bring in power imbalances, and we're also going to talk about emotions. So very generally, and some of you who've been through LJS work before will remember this scheme of teaching. And so I want to go back and really review. And for those of you who are new, please, again, ask your questions throughout, and we'll keep track of those and make sure that we catch you up and on board for the process. So there's basically these 4 stages in Perry's theme of cognitive and ethical development, and they map pretty nicely onto your first, second, third, and fourth year of college in a sort of traditional way. The first stage that Perry identifies in his model is dualism. The second, multiplicity. The third, contextual relativism. The fourth, committed relativism. And essentially, dualism is when you think in terms of good and bad, right or wrong, this or that. And this is an important piece when we're talking about dualism, because it's really looking at the fear. So dualism is a fear-based or rigid response. We tend to think in terms of good and bad, right or wrong, this or that. It's when we tend to project deviance or abnormality onto others. So it might be an experience where you have heard, or maybe you've been that person who said, oh my gosh, how can those people eat that stuff? Or how can those people live like that? So when we're projecting onto others from our frame of reference, then, and we make them wrong or deviant, that's a sign of dualism. When we rely on a higher rule, regulation, or authority to tell us either how to think or how to behave or what to believe, that's also an indication of dualism. And also when we're unable to imagine creative alternatives. Now, I want to be really clear that dualism is not about a political position. We can be just as dualistic on the left as we can on the right. And I think it's important to remember that. So one of the phrases that was really popular and I think is still stated today in many activist circles that I'm a part of is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That's a dualistic statement. It's an either or, this or that, right or wrong, good or bad. And so that's the important thing to remember when we're talking about dualism, is that it's not about what's right. It's not about right and wrong. It's about rigidity. So dualism is an indication of that. And I think one of the things that we don't acknowledge when we're looking at dualism, and certainly this wasn't in Perry's original thinking, is that it's the emotion of fear that's really driving dualistic behavior. If you think about those of you who attended college, had an opportunity to perhaps even go away to school, if you think about what it was like that first year, when you first arrived, how scared you might have been. To think that you were going to fail out or be exposed as the fraud. And I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many of you were afraid that first year of college when you went, that someone was going to find out how stupid you really were and that you didn't belong there, and that, you know, it was that what they call the imposter syndrome was at play? Yeah, so I can see a lot of hands are going up just with the idea, just the memory of that experience for you. We've got about 30 people that are raising their hands for that, 40. And so we really want to acknowledge that fear is a motivator here, and really that's the thing that keeps us rigid and stuck. And we want to acknowledge that that can show up in our communications. There's a saying, there's a poster at the Center for Intercultural Communication here in Portland. It says there are USers who travel around the world and really benefit from these intercultural experiences, and then there are USers who travel the world and continue to have US experiences in the vicinity of other countries. And we would say that's an example of dualism, right? How do we be in the context, someone else's difference? In dualism, we can't. We can't shift out of our frame of reference, and usually that's motivated by fear. It's important to remember a frame of reference is simply the way that you know the world. It's the way that you grew up. It's the value systems of your parents and your faith community. It's the way that you know to interact with the world. So that's what we're talking about with frames of reference. So he noticed that primarily in the first year. By the second year, he would notice that these students perhaps were taking a class with an expert who had just as much qualification and authority and high level degrees as the person they took a course with in the same subject their first year, but they completely disagree with each other. There's difference, right? So in multiplicity, we're beginning to entertain that there are multiple perspectives. There's this idea that we're still in our frame of reference, and maybe we're not projecting that someone's abnormal or they're deviant, but we're certainly projecting that they're other, that they're not us, right? And so we're separating, still we're seeing ourselves as separate from them. Also in multiplicity, there's a little bit of an attitude of like anything goes. It's really hard for us to stay rooted and grounded in a value system. In multiplicity, we're not able to make assessments. And we're going to talk more about the power and the importance of being able to make assessments. And then finally, in multiplicity, we cannot acknowledge that there's imbalances of power. And that's an important piece as well. So multiplicity, if you could summarize that stage, is that we're all different, basically. That's what the final word is. Now, if we go back, the next two phases in Perry's scheme of cognitive and ethical development, and again, we're going to be applying this strictly to cross-culture communication. This is important. These next two stages means that we're able to get in the context of someone else's difference. So we're no longer in our place projecting from someone onto someone else, either deviance or difference. We're now able to shift literally and to get into their context. And in contextual relativism, and this is an important stage, we're able to get into the context of someone else's difference, but we become their difference. We get stuck, in other words, in that difference. And that is an unfortunate place. It looks really progressive from the outside, and that's an important reminder. You know, from the outside, it looks like, oh, I really value this group. I see myself as part of this group. But essentially what we're doing is using other people's context, or if you will, other people's lived experience to fill a void of emptiness or lack of in our own experience. And it's also an example of not being grounded in our own value system. Now, Perry suggests in his model, and I agree in terms of its application, that we all go through all of these stages. So this isn't about judging who's in what stage or not, because if we're on this journey, we're all going to touch these stages. And it's important for us to remember that and help us hopefully come with more compassion to that experience. And so if we think about, I can think about some examples of contextual relativism in my experience. There's probably a few people on this line who are from Santa Cruz. I spent a number of years in Santa Cruz, California, and there mostly for graduate school, and then just after graduate school at UCSC. And Santa Cruz was a really different environment from where I grew up. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, very much bonded, and also in Tucson, Arizona, but I identify as a Midwesterner, city kid. You know, I had most recently come from an urban area in New England as an undergrad. And when I showed up in Santa Cruz, I thought I was in woo-woo land. And I say this with tons of love and affection in my heart, because I love me some Santa Cruz. But this was really not my context. And I remember walking down the Pacific Garden Mall in downtown Santa Cruz, you know, one afternoon with some of my friends from the university, including some friends who happened to be Indian. And we would start to laugh and joke that we knew an Indian guru had been to town, because all of a sudden downtown Santa Cruz was filled with primarily white people wearing saris and Indian clothing, and women with bindis on their foreheads. And you know, Eastern religion was really big at that time when I was living in Santa Cruz. And there are many wonderful teachings that I actually gained from being exposed to that. But like any movement where we get stuck in contextual relativism, we end up taking the trappings or the fringe elements, if you would, of a cultural experience or a religious experience, or and then we say that that is the center or the core of what the experience is. And that is, unfortunately, that's contextual relativism. And I know this also from my experience. And so, you know, I would go up for my girlfriends, and then I would go up to someone who I recognize and be like, "Hey, Sarah, how's it going?" And she would say, "I've changed my name to Sita. I'm no longer Sarah." And that was a moment of like, wait a minute. They would say like, well, I'm trying to be more, they're trying to act more Indians than Indians. And my girlfriends who are from India would say, we don't act like that. We don't dress like that. And so that's an example of contextual relativism. Of course, we see this much more prevalently in terms of appropriation of culture and cultural expressions. And appropriation is different than benign culture sharing and cultural expression and influence. And I think that that is what we really want to acknowledge. So yeah, some people are getting that basically contextual relativism is cultural appropriation. Thank you. Some people are getting connecting those concepts. And I have a couple more examples, which I'll share later if time permits, and I'm happy to, if people would like more examples personally of how that's impacted my life. But I want to go ahead and move now to committed relativism. So this is also when we've been able to shift frames of reference and get into someone else's context. But there's a really big difference when we're in committed to relativism and we're not in contextual relativism. Just a reminder, when we go back to Perry's model, in contextual relativism, this might look like your third year of university, you're traveling abroad, maybe in his example of like Joe Harvard, it would be where you buy the tweed jacket with the leather patches and you start smoking the pipe and you become Joe Harvard. In other words, you get into the context of the difference and you no longer can distinguish yourself from it. And so if we think about the example of committed relativism, this is when he noticed that students were able to entertain two opposing things as both being true. They were able to make assessments and they were able to live with ambiguity. He noticed that students in their communication were rooted in their own value system and that they were able to understand opposing points of view, even if they didn't agree with them, and still allow the possibility of being influenced by them. So in committed relativism, we're able to see, understand, and hear, and even willing to be moved and influenced by the experience of someone else that we might deeply oppose. And being value-based is the key piece that we want to emphasize in this model. And committed relativism is the stage in which we can actually become value-based in our communications with each other. Now, I want to just really re-emphasize why we're talking about communications. And this is critical here as you take a look at this model. Some people say to me like, well, it's really not about relationships. That's really touchy-feely. It's not the core of how we're going to change systems. And then I'll ask them, well, what is a system? Well, a system is it's held up by institutions. And then I'll say, so what's an institution? Well, an institution is it's a structure that's basically what? It's led and filled and reinforced and made up of people. And so if we fail to really address and understand the ways that we as individuals and humans are interacting in the relationships that we're having with each other and how we're communicating and treating each other, as humans, we're going to fail to address the root causes of what can shift any system or institution or set of policies, which are human beings. And so if we can hold that at the core, that our framework is that relationships are acts of revolution, where we're authentically connecting with other human beings, we would never stand for oppression, ever. We would always stand up against oppression. And there have been study upon study where being influenced personally because of a connection that we have with another human being often is the difference between us taking a courageous stand or not. And I, for those who identify as parents on the call, I'm just curious, but maybe again by show of hands, how many of you have been amazed at the stands that you've been able to take, courageous stands on behalf of your children or young ones that you've raised, or maybe as an auntie or an uncle or a grandparent that you've been amazed and shocked by your capacity for that. So I'm seeing some hands go up. And so I'm hoping you're getting this picture that these relationships that we have often as parents or caregivers for other human beings, that can really become the foundation for how we can change and shift our planet and to create more justice for all. So I think we can use that as a framework even when they're not our children. So I want to come back to look at the scheme of cognitive and ethical development. And I want to give us an opportunity to hear an example of how we might communicate differently as we move across the scale. And in a little bit, I'm going to ask you to give us some examples in the question and answer section so that we can apply it to your example. But I want to stick with parenting here, again, because most of us are either parents or we've been parented. I think that covers a majority of humans on the planet. And so it becomes an example that more of us can relate to, and then we'll apply this in other contexts as well. So the example that I often share in our workshops comes from my mentor, a woman named Lillian Roybal Rose, who I learned this model from. And she would describe the experience that she had of her daughter turning 13, which happened to be in September at the start of her high school career. So a little context setting for those of you who aren't familiar with Santa Cruz, which is where Lillian and her daughter were living. Her daughter announced to her that now that she's going to be turning 14 and now that she is going to be starting high school, she is going to have her birthday party, which she always has, beach parties and birthday parties, on one of the North Coast beaches in Santa Cruz County. Now, for those of you, again, who aren't familiar with Santa Cruz County, let me set the scene. In the city, the municipal beaches are well patrolled, they're well lit, there's bathrooms, there's fire pits. They're actually in neighborhoods, these beaches, and so you can't actually have super loud music or stay out late beyond 10 o'clock because there's noise ordinances. But they're very well patrolled, they're super family friendly. How would you feel about your 14-year-old having a birthday party on one of those municipal beaches? I'm guessing most of you would say that sounds right. So if you want to show by show of hands, raise your hands. Yep, we're good with that. That sounds right. Now I'm going to describe, and keep raising your hands. We're watching those counts go up. If you're with us on this one, great. Now I'm going to describe what a North Coast beach looks like. So Santa Cruz is on the coast. You have to go down Highway 1, which is an isolated highway to get to the beaches on the North Coast, on the North County part of Santa Cruz County. You can't actually see the beaches from the road. You have to climb up cliffs and down cliffs to get to those beaches. There are people living on those beaches. There are drug deals and drug using happening on those beaches. There's been rapes, attempted rapes, murders, and attempted murders on some of those beaches in the North Coast part of Santa Cruz County. So by show of hands, how many of you are willing to have your 14-year-old have her birthday party on a North Coast beach in Santa Cruz County? And those numbers are dropping off big time. So there are no hands at this point showing. 2 hands. Okay. 2 brave souls. Okay, so we're really clear what the outcome is. And I think that that's going to be important to remember, that what you do does not determine where you are on the scale. And this is the tricky part, because in the world of equity, everybody's looking for a recipe. Everybody wants, like, well, what do I do? What's my checklist? I don't have a checklist. I don't have recipes. I only have relationships, just relationships. And the way we have a just relationship is that we communicate as peers outside of posture, outside of pretense, and outside of power. And that's what we're working to do here, and to give us a language and a process to understand where are we on this scale so that we can have just relationships. If I were going to come from dualism, we're going to give the example of playing the mother. So those of you who want to identify with the parent here, I'm going to role play that out, okay? In dualism, a communication to my 14-year-old daughter might sound something like this. What? You're gonna, what? No, you're not gonna have your birthday party on a North Coast beach in Santa Cruz County. Do you want to get murdered and raped? Do you remember those questions that your parents would ask you like that? No, of course, the 14-year-old doesn't want to get murdered and raped. Nonetheless, the parent will continue. We continue. No, porque yo mando, because I say so. No, the answer is no. So that is a fear-based, rigid response. Okay, we came from, I invoked my higher rule, my regulation, my authority as the parent. No. Why no? Because I say so. And why do I get to say so? Because I'm the parent, I'm the higher authority. Those are the clues that you're coming from dualism. In multiplicity, a communication might sound something like this. Wow, you know, my parents were really strict with me and that was never really helpful. Gosh, you know, some kids do get to have their birthday party on these North Coast beaches. Maybe I'm just being really strict. You know, if I push back on this one, I'm just going to have 4 years of rebellion. I don't need that. You go back and forth, right? There's this idea that you're not really rooted and grounded in your role as the parent. You're easily influenced and swayed. Again, if you have had the experience of being a teenager, you know how to play this one really well. We all do, where it's kind of, it feels not clear what the right answer is, and we get stuck in multiplicity. That's that place of kind of anything could go. Often in a parenting situation, and certainly Lillian shares this in her example, she gets good and mad at herself, and then not knowing what else to do kind of kicks back into dualism, does a fear-based response, and says no. Now the next 2 stages, the parent in this communication is able to get into the context of the young person, and this is important. Again, being able to shift out of another person, out of your context into someone else's, is a critical stage of development, ethical and cognitive, in our ability to communicate in a just way. In contextual relativism, though, the parent gets stuck in the context of the young person. So the communication might sound something like this. Oh, that's a great idea. There'll be nobody else around. We can stay up till all hours, 2 or 3. I think your birthday's on a school night. I'll let you stay home from school. No big deal. And there's this brew pub downtown. I think they'll get us a keg for cheap if we go to them because they're brand new and they're running a promotion. Oh, and I've got this great new mini skirt I can wear. In other words, this is the parent who gets into the context of their young person and then becomes a young person. They've lost track again of their role as parent in this communication. And as a result, they're not able to be just in the relationship. In committed relativism, a communication might sound something like this. I totally get why you would want to have your birthday party on a North Coast beach. It makes all the sense. There wouldn't be any grown-ups around. There's no curfew to have to finish up at 10 o'clock. It's a sign that I'm trusting you and you're having more responsibility. And these are some of the reasons why I'm going to say no. In other words, in this communication, the parent is very clear that their role is as parent. Now, as parent, they don't rely on the higher rule, regulation, or authority to make the decision whether or not to allow their 14-year-old to have a birthday party on the North Coast beach. They come to that decision from an assessment. And this is very key. This is how we know the difference, because in dualism, the parent said no, and in committed relativism, the parent also said no. So, and it's not that you said it with a nicer voice. Now, I know I did do some voice very changing up there. It really is that in committed relativism, the parent assesses that it's not a safe place for a 14-year-old girl to have their birthday party, not because it's a fear-based response where it is just because I say so. Now, that being said, in committed relativism, you can allow yourself to be influenced by someone else's experience. And the other key way that you know that you're in committed relativism is that you allow the other frame of reference to be normal as well. In other words, it's just as valid for a 14-year-old person to believe that they're indestructible. It's absolutely valid for a 14-year-old to think that they're completely safe everywhere they walk in the world. And by saying no in committed relativism, we don't shame the 14-year-old for their experience, for their frame of reference. And that's critical here. In dualism, there's a shaming. What, you want to get murdered and raped? That's a question, it's a rhetorical act of essentially making someone feel stupid and shamed for their frame of reference. So it's important to be paying attention to those clues of when you're coming from committed relativism. Did you come from an assessment or a fear-based response? Do you allow the person not to be othered or deviant or abnormal or stupid in their frame of reference? And then the third piece is that I would say is that you're not expecting a particular response from the other person to justify your decision. And this is really key here. So when I make the decision as a parent, for example, to say no in committed relativism, I then don't expect the 14-year-old to be eternally grateful to me because I saved their lives, right? And more than likely, they're going to be pissed. They're going to be angry. They're going to be upset. They're going to maybe even hate on me as the parent. That's got to be okay. It can't be that I now hold my correct assessment as emotional extortion, because when I do that, and this is the tricky part. So although Perry laid out the scheme of cognitive and ethical development as a linear system, as if you get on the train in dualism and then you get off at your destination in committed relativism and whoa, you're enlightened, it's more a circular pattern, because the minute I start to beat you up with my enlightenment, I've now become the dualist. And so this is a slippery slope. It's a really challenging place for us to pay attention to in our own thinking. Where have we crossed the line and become dualistic and fear-based? The last piece of the example that I do want to share, and I certainly hope you're coming up with some examples of your own, and we can definitely look at some of in the question and answer, we want to come back and apply this to your context. But the other key piece to acknowledge here in committed relativism is that dualism does see things in black and white, right or wrong, good or bad, whereas in committed relativism, they recognize and acknowledge the good and the bad, the black and the white, but they also acknowledge the million creative alternatives, or the shades of gray, if you will, between black and white. So in this example, I will share that Lillian's daughter was brilliant, anticipating a fear-based dualistic response. She sort of had a list in her mind of the things that her mother would object to about a birthday party on a North Coast beach, and so she came prepared. And she said, I talked to Mrs. Robinson. That's the access to that beach that most people don't know about unless they're locals, because you have to go right by her house. Well, she said we could definitely go have access there, and we can use her fridge so that nothing would go bad and get food poisoning, and we can use her phone if there's an emergency. This was before cell phones were so ubiquitous, and use her bathroom. So she's totally down for it. And I talked to my older brother Michael, and he's willing to chaperone with some of his friends as well. And what Lillian found herself saying is, have a good time. So this is another clue that you are coming from committed relativism, is that you're able to entertain creative alternatives to the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the this and the that. And again, it's not that those are wrong, it's just that they're limited and they're rigid in their experience. So again, the slippage into dualism is where we're going to end up in fear if we start to beat people up with our enlightenment. So how do you talk to a dualist? I know it's probably obvious that you're thinking of all the people who are dualists in your life right now, but of course, we're also that dualist at times when we come from the fear. But first, let's just imagine, what is it like to talk to a dualist? I want to use an example, and I'm going to role play it out here on the webinar for you. And it's an example starts with an old Peace Corps commercial. And this is actually the ad that used to run in the in magazines, but it also was an ad on television, and I'm just old enough to remember it. And it was very grainy and black and white, and the commercial, as it showed up on the television screen, would be the empty glass, and you'd see a hand with a pitcher of water come in and say, "How do you see the glass, half empty or half full?" If you think the glass is half empty, then maybe the Peace Corps isn't for you. But if you think the glass half full, join the Peace Corps, right? And then again, in my era, there would be a phone number that would flash across the screen for people to call. Now, I know that those of you who are able to think in what we would call a committed relativist fashion, you're able to understand the abstract concept that's being taught here, even though we're looking at something very concrete like a glass of water and the water fill line of half and half. The concepts that the commercial or the ad are trying to reach for are much more nuanced than that, much more ambiguous. We're trying to get at the idea of optimism and how you see the world, right? Which we couldn't particularly measure, and also is very challenging to communicate to someone who's coming from a dualistic perspective. So if you get this commercial, you get that it's about optimism and how you view the world and possibilities. And when I'm coming from dualism, remember, I'm a concrete thinker. I'm going to be looking at that glass and I'm going to be saying drop for drop, ounce for ounce, it's the same amount of water. It shouldn't matter how you see the glass, half empty or half full, it's the same amount of water. And you're going to try and explain to me like how life is better and rosier if I can see the glass is half full, and I'm going to be like, you can put on any rosy colored glasses you want, but ounce for ounce, drop for drop, it's the same amount of water. The reality is, if you and I are out on a desert island and we both get the same cup of water, we're going to die at the same time. I'm going to keep coming down to counting drops. I'm going to keep invoking the reality is. So if you are one of those at times who've done reality is over and over again, we can probably guess you are coming from a place of dualism. That's a really good clue that we're stuck in some way. We can't think outside of the either or of the situation that's in front of us. So if you get this concept, how do you talk to the dualist? Because for the most part, you're going to be crossing each other. And I do want to take a minute right now to do a poll. How many of you have had that conversation with somebody where you're trying to get them to see the glass half empty or half full, and they're counting drops and telling you the reality is, and you get frustrated and stuck? And yeah, I can see the hands going up. Yep. And you're just like talking louder, louder, louder. You're exhausted and you just can't reach them. Yeah. And the problem is that we're not hearing each other at the place where we can connect. We're not able to shift the frame of reference. We're both actually stuck in dualism in some way. I'm stuck in the dualism of wanting you to see from my perspective, and they're stuck in the dualism of counting drops and seeing it from their perspective. And it's important to remember that being a dualist is not about being good or bad. That's actually not the point. The point is that when we come from a dualistic perspective, we're limited in what becomes possible to imagine. So we're not going to judge it. We're not going to rank it or rate it. We're just going to identify that there's a rigidity and a limited way of looking at the world when we come from dualism. And so how can we help influence the dualist to think differently, to move out of their fear, even as we let go of outcome at the same time? And this is another critical skill when we're able to come from committed relativism. And I mean let go of outcome, but not like, I'm out of here. There's the letting go, and then there's the disconnecting and the out of here. This is that moment when you're blocking people on your Facebook friends, or defriending people, or you don't go to that person's house for dinner anymore, or you stopped calling that relative. That's not letting go. That's a disconnect. And we want to be more skillful than that in this day and age, and we can be with the right tools and frameworks. And that's what we're hoping that this process, that Perry's scheme of cognitive ethical development applied to our relationships and communication, will give us more applicable tools for how to both stay engaged with people that we vehemently disagree with, but we can still respect and understand their humanity. This is the critical difference in how I think we see the discourse among our society today. So how do we begin to talk to the dualist? What are some examples? Well, the best example that I can think of is actually a story about a father who's driving his little boy to preschool. And I'll get to the point at the end, but I think the metaphor is a powerful one. And on the route to preschool, they pass a building. And when they get to that point, the little boy points out the window and he says to his dad, "What's that?" And the dad says, "That's a lumberyard." And the little boy says, "Oh." Well, the next day, dad's driving the little one to preschool again, and they take the same route and they pass the building. And at exactly the same moment, the little boy points out the window and he says, "What's that?" And the dad looks again and he's a little slightly more irritated. He says, "That's a lumberyard." And the little boy says, "Oh." Next day, they're driving to school. They take the same route, and the brave little boy, again, when they pass the building, points out the window and says, "What's that, Dad?" And this time, the dad says, "Remember when last summer, we were building that fence and painting that fence in the backyard?" And the little boy says, "Yes." "Remember I told you that those boards that we were working with, well, they come from trees?" And he says, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, when you cut down trees and you make boards out of them, you store them in a place called the lumberyard. And so when you want to build a fence, you go to the lumberyard to buy your boards." And the little boy says, "Oh." The next day, they were driving to preschool, and the little boy said, when they got to that building, points out the window and excitedly says to his dad, "Look, Dad, there's the lumberyard." You see, you cannot teach the lumberyard. That's the abstract concept, right? We don't know what a lumberyard is. The little boy has nothing to connect that to. That's the idea of optimism and the glass half full. I don't understand that when I'm coming fear-based. I don't have that experience until you can connect that to the person's fence. And your fence is that lived experience. It's the thing that you know. It's the thing you've touched. That fence is the concrete. That's the thing. That's why we say that listening is the most powerful political tool that you can ever learn. And that is a direct quote from Dr. Erica Sharover Marcuse, who was Lillian's mentor. If you want to figure out how to move the dualist from their position, you listen for their fence and you relate the concept to their fence. More often than not, we don't listen for the fence. We get distracted by talking about drops and how much water's in the glass. It's not about the water in the glass. It's never about the water in the glass. The water in the glass becomes a symbol of some other place where they have been able to, they've gotten scared, where we've gotten scared, where we've become rigid or protective, and we're now funneling that fear into counting drops in a glass that's half full or half empty, but really we can't see that. So this is the example that I wanted to check in with you about, and I'm just curious if any of you had some examples, and I see an example I want to see. I'm going to just read this question out loud. What about people who excuse racist views as free speech and that people are allowed to hold those views? And if we oppose that, are we switching back to dualism? It can be confusing to track where we are holding ourselves in relationship to other, and is it ever favorable to be in a dualist state? We would say it's never favorable to be in a dualist state because it means that we're rigid and fear-based and not able to be influenced by others. And I think the core thing to look at is, how do we hold the value of free speech and at the same time protect people from hatred? And I think that that is a conversation that is one that is a committed relativist conversation, okay? It's one that has to allow for ambiguity. It's one that we need to be able to entertain two opposing things that could both be true. And I think that the level of our discourse at this point around these issues has been one of making the other ones wrong and name calling, and definitely making abnormal the other person's position and often the person who's on the other side. And so I think this is a really good live example for how we can begin to apply this framework. How would you have the conversation with somebody who's defending free speech in favor of hate speech? Have we taken the time to really listen to each person, or even one person who believes in that wholly? And are you able to get beyond the counting drops with them and get to what's the root fear that's underneath that for them? That's what we would suggest is the next step in this model and approach. So we want to begin to apply this framework to understanding the difference between equality and equity. And we tend to live in a society that's very equal values, that for equal protections. Certainly our legal system tends to value equality but not equity. And there is an important difference here when we think about equity. And we're going to talk you through some of these examples. The best example that I can think of is, think about a time where you were at a large event venue. So it could be a sports arena, it could be a concert hall, it could be a fairgrounds. And these are structures that were built maybe 20 or more years ago. So certainly this is changing and relatively quickly in new construction. But if it was built a while back or hasn't been renovated or updated, I want to ask you to think for a minute, what do you see at intermission? So let's say there's a break in the event and you are going to go to the bathroom and you see these lines, not everywhere, just the women's restroom, right? You get to see these long lines that often are, snaking around corners, and the men's bathroom door is just swinging freely, okay? Someone, probably I'm going to guess someone from the dominant culture perspective, and if we talk about what dominance, we're going to talk a little bit more about dominance and power here. When we come from dominance is the group or the groups, any frame of reference that has institutional power and control. Dominance is not about numbers, and that's really important to remember. So it's not about the majority because there's more people. It's who has control of those systems that reinforce their thinking, okay? So probably someone from dominant culture, and we're going to use this example, we're going to talk about sex. So a male decided that in order to be fair, we're going to build sports arenas with bathrooms that are 1-to-1. Okay, so that's equality. The males get one bathroom, females get one bathroom. And everyone thinks, well, that is fair, until you actually make an assessment for the difference. And so this is where we're going to lay over the committed relativist thinking. So when we're coming from committed relativism, you want to also make an assessment. And there was a study done, for example, that for every minute that it takes a man to use the restroom, it actually takes women 3 minutes. Now, this is not about makeup or other things that we do in a bathroom. This is just a process of using a toilet. And so if you make an assessment for the context, and this is really key here, then fair becomes 1-to-3. In other words, this is what equity looks like in the context of sex and bathroom ratios. When we come from dualism, this makes no sense. This feels like, well, women are getting special rights. Females are getting more access to more bathrooms than males have. And again, this is assuming that these events are being attended at a ratio at which females and males are on the planet, so 50-50 more or less. And again, these numbers are very rough and generalized if you get the meaning. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about equity here. And so when we're able to assess for the context, that's a sign that we are coming from committed relativism and that we're coming from equity. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Lillian and I were called in to work with a school district because the teacher, there was an incident. The principal had some trouble getting the teachers to the teachers meeting on time. And one of the things that we often will joke about when we work with educators, as it is with all groups, is that the teachers tend to take on the worst behaviors of their students once they don't have to be in charge of the classroom. And we all have this in all of our fields. And so, of course, coming late and passing notes, those are just some things that happened. And so the principal was noticing that coming late was one of the issues that he wanted to try and figure out. But he wanted to do it lightly. He didn't want to be heavy-handed and dualistic about it. So he asked another teacher if she would be willing to be in charge of getting folks to the meetings on time. And he thought it would be more important to come from a peer. And she was so excited to take on this role. And she wanted also to be light and playful. So she would, every week or every other week when the meetings were happening, she'd go to the library and she'd look up cute little poems and rhymes on time. And she'd put the time and date and place of the meeting. And then she'd include a little poem and often a little graphic or a picture on the note. She'd put it on different colored papers and put them in each of the teachers' boxes. So when they got to school, they'd see the notice. And so she found some poem, and I'm not going to remember it exactly, but I only heard it once, but it was something like, don't be stupid, don't be lazy, be on time, or you're crazy. So it rhymed, and it had the concept of stupid, lazy, and crazy in it. And she put the time and date and place of the meeting, and the little graphic that she put on the bottom of the little piece of paper was a picture of a Mexican, a man with a sombrero, sleeping under a cactus. Now, for some of you listening into this webinar, you will not understand the context that would make this offensive, and I'm not going to explain it to you. However, I can tell you that when the teacher who did this showed up at the teachers' meeting, the next teachers' meeting, she was definitely confronted by a number of teachers who found that completely offensive, and she was called in to talk about that with these teachers. And she was genuinely mortified. You know, she listened to their hurts and complaints about it. And then she went home that night, she said, and she said she thought about it because she came back the next morning and she was angry. And she said, you know, I went home and I thought about what you said and I thought about it. And I myself am an immigrant and I would never hurt immigrant people. I think you people are oversensitive and you're looking for trouble. And, you know, I really just think you're blowing something. You're making mountains out of molehills is what she said. You're just blowing this up. And she said, and you know why I know that you're doing that? She said, because I, as an immigrant from Russia, I wouldn't be offended if it was a picture of a Russian sleeping under a cactus. Now, I just want you to think about this for 1 minute, or maybe less. Why would this teacher not be offended by a picture of a Russian sleeping under a cactus? Anybody want to put that into a Q&A? Anyone want to guess why that would be? Yeah, because there aren't cactuses in Russia, exactly. There's no context, historical, geographical, topographical, for which to make that image offensive. Now, if it was a picture of a Russian with a bottle of vodka under a lamppost, there is a historical context to make that offensive. So you can't, the context matters, right? You can't ignore the context when you're thinking about equity. Another example, and this is really important when you think about, well, another example I'll just share is we were called in to work with a fraternity in Southern California. They weren't really going to have a slave auction. I mean, really, people, come on, you know, it's the 2000s. We wouldn't really do that. But yeah, I know the flyer had a picture of an African heritage man with a chain around his neck. And yeah, I know, but you guys are just blowing this, you know, you're just blowing this out of proportion. This is just like, you know, it's just an advertisement. We're trying to get people to come to our fundraiser, with an inability to understand in the context of the history of chattel slavery in the United States. There is, you cannot take that image of an African heritage man with a chain around his neck out of context and not have that be racism. It is racism. And this is a really key example of that. So assessing for context is going to be critical, and this is where relationships matter. If you have a communication that is truly peer-based, that is truly just, there can be no imbalance of power, okay? So if we use the example, for example, and I'm going to come back to sexism. So let's say there's a man and he works with another man, so they're peer. Let's say they're both the same race, same socioeconomic class, they have the same position in the organization, and one man says to the other man, hey, would you go get me a cup of coffee? And when it's a peer relationship, it doesn't really matter what the response is of the man that he's asked to get the cup of coffee. He can get the cup of coffee, not get the cup of coffee, blow him off, ignore him, whatever. When it's a peer-based experience, that relationship is intact and there's no power imbalance, there's no dominance, that is an equity request. However, if a man asks that of a female, given the history and current context of male domination and sexism targeting females, go get me a cup of coffee crosses the line and becomes sexism. Females are not making mountains out of molehills. We're not looking for trouble. We're not oversensitive. That request in the context where there is now a power imbalance becomes sexism. And it's important to recognize that context, because now the female has to make a decision. You know, do I get the cup of coffee? Do I not get the cup of coffee? What message am I sending if I get the cup of coffee? If I don't get the cup of coffee, if I don't have power in this organization and that male person is my boss, what is that going to do? Blah, blah, blah. You can see all the layers there. And I'm not here to say what the right or wrong answer is. The key here is, how do we think through the context? I can't tell you how many men I have listened to about how they don't know how to interact with female colleagues anymore. Well, is everything I do sexist? Is it all male domination? Do I ask to have a cup of coffee or not get a cup of coffee? Do I hold the door? Do I not hold the door? The waffling, the back and forth, resonate for anybody as multiplicity? Is anybody remembering all of that? Yeah, not grounded in values, not value-based in the responses. The key here, and this is where we come back to relationships, is that if we have a relationship, I as a female would love to get you a cup of coffee. It's a value that I have for you. If we have a relationship and my arms are full and it looks like I'm struggling and you are a male and hold the door open for me, I could be really grateful for that. If however the context in which you're doing that is we don't have a relationship, or you're communicating this message that I need to be protected or I'm weak, I'm going to resist that, and I think it's important that we both understand what is our value that's motivating this behavior or our response, and B, do we have the relationship to work through it? Because if we have the relationship and you as a male boss ask me to go get a cup of coffee, I don't then turn and blow you out of the water for it, or walk away, or need to look for another job, or file a sexual harassment suit. We have a context and a relationship where we can start to build a rapport, and I can begin to challenge the dominance that's playing out for you. So we have a great question is, what do you do when men don't believe that there's been a history of oppression of women? I don't have an answer for you. I would say, who's the man? What's your relationship with them? Do you have enough slack? Is this a woman or a man that's asking me? And do you have the resources to listen to them? And I think this is the key thing when we're talking about power imbalances. People often will say to me, well, as a member of the target group, it's not my job to educate the non-targets. And I would say, yes, it's true. It is not our job. And I think there is an expectation and an exploitation of our experiences. We're often unpaid or undervalued for the resources that we're giving to shift people. And yet I can tell you, where I have connection, where I have relationships, I would want nothing more than to be the person that they would come to, where I could give them my experience and we could deepen an intimate connection there. I don't personally find that exhausting. I find that rewarding and deepening of intimacy. And if we want relationships to be the foundation for change, we can't have relationships without trust, and we can't have trust without intimacy. And there's got to be a place, I believe, in this work for us to have those vulnerable moments and those frustrations to come up. And there's got to be places where we also can say no, and it's okay, and they can find other resources to do that work. It's not an either or, this or that, right or wrong, good or bad. It's the place that we need to be able to decide that this relationship is the place where we can make systemic change happen. And it means that we both need to invest in that. Now, does that mean that we're the only people that are going to do that? No. I also, as the target group, need to have other places to go to get that resource. And if we're going to talk about, the example of sexism, I need other women to go and get resources from. I need to be able to vent, to be able to share my experiences. And to be honest, we need male allies. I need male allies, and I have them to vent and be outraged and upset with. I remember I had this, and I would also offer that males need to lean on other males for that experience as well, not only females in those relationships, to learn about sexism and male domination. Believe me, we need more resource, not less. And I'm happy to be one of those resources in the places, even where I'm a target. I had this person, male in one of my workshops, and just say, I'm so sick and tired of being the bad guy. I opened the door the other day for this woman, and I was being a gentleman and I was being kind, and she ripped me a new one. And what I said was, are you opening the door because you want us to like you? Because if you're opening the door because you want us females to like you, then that's emotional extortion. And that's paternalism and condescension. And that's one of the worst forms of sexism. You don't open the door or not open the door expecting us to have a response, because that might be example number 382 of sexism that I've had in the last 3 days, and I ain't got no more resource. I'm done. And guess what? You're going to hear it. And what's fabulous when we're rooted and grounded as allies is we see that as an honor, that I happen to be the one that you could vent and show the frustration and rage and upset of sexism and male domination and its impact on your life. Lucky me. And that's a huge shift in frame. Now, it doesn't mean that as men, you then go nowhere with that and you sort of internalize that from a place of feeling guilty. That's not what we're going for. Men need to find other men to talk about what it was like to be targeted and what it's like to hear the experiences, really hear the experiences of females on the target side of oppression. Thank you for these questions. I'm going to go ahead and take us through our question and answer period right now. So we're going to be tracking your question and answers. First, we just want to ask for reflection. So first, what clarifications do you still need about the Perry model? What things haven't made sense to you? Where would you prefer some nuance? We've definitely got some really good questions throughout. We've tried to answer them throughout. And I'm just going to keep going through the questions, and feel free to dive in if there's places that you want to go in. What was most surprising to you about this model? What was surprising? And we'll look in the Q&A box. Anyone surprised by anything you learned today? All right, we're going to keep going. This one's a little bit more of a self-reflective question that we're hoping you'll take a minute to answer. Thinking about your dualism, how do you think it impacts your ability to listen and understand people from other cultural contexts? And I'm going to go back and share my example around contextual relativism, because I know that it had an impact on me being able to really listen. So I have a really dear friend who knows how important my heritage is for me as a Puerto Rican and as a Chicana, and how important Spanish has been to my reclaiming Spanish has been a part of my experience. And so she decided to learn Spanish and then surprise me with it. So one day she just busts out and she starts speaking Spanish to me, and I was really taken aback. And she's like, "Oh, I didn't tell you. I wanted it to be a surprise. I've been studying Spanish." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing." And then she says, "Oh yeah, and I applied to this program, and I'm going to be getting to go study in Mexico, actually in a state in Michoacan, which is where my grandfather's from, which I've never gotten to go to." So I did notice a little bit of jelly coming up in me. I was feeling a little bit not liking this as much where it was going. And then she's like, "Yeah, and then maybe you can come visit me, and I'm going to be living with a family, and I'll be back in 6 months." And I had a little twinge when she left, and I decided not to go visit her when she was there. But when she came back, oh my gosh, she spoke better Spanish than I spoke. She's like, "And I eat chili harder than you eat chili, and I know how to make tamales now, and I know how to dance these dances that you don't know how to dance. And oh my gosh, I have this new Mexican boyfriend. He's really hot," and on and on and on and on. And I just kept noticing that the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up on end, and I couldn't figure out why I didn't like everything she was saying, and I just felt so angry. And this is an example of me really being dualistic, right? I couldn't hear where she was coming from because I felt so attacked in many ways. And in some ways, she was being dualistic. And she was stuck in contextual relativism, and I was having a dualistic experience with it. What was her contextual relativism? She was taking the trappings and the handles of my culture and saying that's who we are. And when you do that to people, you make them exotic. But people are not exotic. You see, if you want to be Mexican, you don't just get the great food and the parties and the music and the language. You also have to live below the poverty line and have unlimited and have not equal access to quality education and healthcare. You get to have door stands in your places, and you have to have like family members potentially separated because of legal status, and not being able to have access because of language to education and other services. You get the whole package, or you don't get anything at all. And I think that's the piece where her contextual relativism was kind of the worst form, in my view, of paternalism and racism. It's like, you're saying all the right things. I like your people. I like your culture. I like your food. I like your music. But what she was really doing was filling the void of her whiteness, where she didn't have handles to hold on to. And that is often the cost to the non-targets on any side of oppression. And this is the key thing that we don't talk about a lot, is what is the loss on the non-target side. And when there's a loss and there's the fear of not belonging or having home, that's where you're going to see the dualism show up. And in this example, of course, I've now moved to an example of race. So we had a question about wondering how do I know I'm being dualistic? And that's a really good question. So if you're being rigid, if you're being righteous, if you're being fear-based. If it only looks like it's an either-or opportunity here, or an either-or right or wrong way of thinking, I can promise you're coming from a dualistic perspective. And if you're needing to make the other person wrong or bad, then that's an example. So we did have another question somebody wanted to ask us, which is talk about gossip versus intimate relationships. And I'm wondering if that person can share a little bit more. Gossip. Yeah, so I would say often those of us who've been hurt around intimacy tend to think that gossip is intimacy. And basically anything where we're sharing about people things that we're sharing about people who are not us is gossip. And I know that's a really broad definition of gossip. And some of you will probably disagree with me on that, and that's okay. I think it's an interesting framework to hold, that we often will share the information of others in an attempt to make ourselves feel connected and important to people, but we're not actually being vulnerable about ourselves. And so real intimacy is the opportunity to be vulnerable about ourselves with another person. And this is the key piece that we're working with here in the difference between that. Okay, let's see, tells me Okay, so we have this really great example where someone's bringing up the Holocaust. Does this mean that my anger at someone who tells me that the Holocaust happened a long time ago and by now we should be able to move forward is my dualism? That's a great example. And I think it's one, people say that about slavery happened a long time ago. We don't know why you're still, fixated on it. And the key here, again, when we come from committed relativism is we let go of outcome. It is possible that I will, as a person who's been targeted by oppression, may never be able to let go of my rage and my hurt around it. It doesn't make me wrong or bad, and to fully understand my experience is going to be really important. And the fact that I am then reacting to someone who wants me to get over it then becomes my dualism. So our response is the only thing that we have any control over. We can't control someone else's response. So we have another question here. When efforts at communication are thwarted, and I'm thinking especially of the white supremacists that terrorized my town, what is the next step? So, and I want to I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm going to answer this question. Let me say this. I'm going to assume that the person who asked this question is a white person, and I'm going to start here with white people. And I think one of the tendencies, thank you, yep. So one of the tendencies for us when we're the non-target and we see sort of the worst of the patterns and the anger and the fear showing up in these overtly hate-filled ways, we want to distance ourselves. We want to say that we're not like that. That's not who we are. We want to, in often very dramatic and sometimes, painful ways, separate ourselves out and identify ourselves as, quote, the good white. And again, I'm going to use the example of race here because that was the question, but this can apply to any context of oppression. And I really want to appreciate for the vulnerability of this question. And I think one of the challenges in this work for those of us who are on the non-target wanting to interrupt the oppression of other non-targets is to actually go home, is to recognize that these fellow members of your group are actually your group and they're yours. They're yours to build relationships with, to connect with. And Ricky, Dr. Erica Sheriver Marcuse, used to call this the phenomena of the good white and the bad white. And that that white people who tend to identify as the good white, it's really to separate themselves from the, quote, bad whites. And what I want to offer you is a radical shift here. And I won't be able to teach you this framework today, but it's something I'd like you to consider. There are no good and bad white people. All white people are good people. And once we can establish that all white people are good people, then you don't have to separate out. You can just address the behavior as a fear-based dualistic response. And that's what racism is. It's a fear-based dualistic response of hatred. There's a fear there. There's a loss there. There's something to be understood and connected with. And you can never change hate with hate and hate with distance. We can only change hate with intimacy, connection, and love. And so I often say to my white allies, you do not serve me and you do not serve the cause of racial justice by distancing yourself from your white people. I ask you to go home, whatever that means to you, planting yourself in places where you will be close with and intimate with people who, white people, fellow white people, and I promise you it's probably family members. You don't have to talk with anonymous strangers. You'll probably can find this in your own family network because you learned racism and racist patterns from other white people, and usually the ones that we counted on the most. And this is not about bad people. At no point am I suggesting that your parents and family members are bad people. They're good people. They're hardworking people. They're loving people. They've done the best they could. And what we know is that except for racism, white people have been hit with every other imaginable oppression as any other person on the planet. And we know that hurt people hurt people. And so how do you go home and hear and listen to what is the hurt that's underneath, that's showing up as racism? Don't get lost in the racist rhetoric. Don't get caught in counting drops with them, and don't get distracted by the glass of water. There's something deeper and more profound here that we need to understand about what's motivating this horrible behavior and overt hatred that is showing itself. And I often tell people, thank goodness it's showing up. Thank goodness it's out in the open, because now we know how to address it. This isn't the place to squelch it and push it down and to shame people on top of the fear. It's our work as non-target to non-target to draw that out more and to get the skills and support from other white people and do our own healing work so that we can be more present in the face of what is showing finally in the open again for us to heal completely. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next piece here, and we want to, and I want to thank you again for all of these beautiful comments. We're going to take some time to read these through, and if it makes sense, we'll get back to you in other formats. And we encourage you to stay in touch, and we look forward to that. But first, we'd like to have you in the question and answer period segment. We'd like to, how do you think this framework could help you communicate and deepen relationships across difference and dominance? Where are you seeing some of these applications in your experience right now? And as we wait for some of those to come through, and we'll have Melissa be checking those out, we also just want to open up for any other general questions that you might have at this time. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at another comment that came through. So to bring this mindset and skill to an organization, would you have any recommendations on how to begin this conversation? I think it's going to depend on what is the key element or change that you want to shift. Certainly, I think this webinar is going to be recorded, so you could definitely share it with your colleagues if you think that that would be an opening. I think there's got to be a place where people who are resistant to this mindset can get heard. So if you're able to do enough work where you can come from committed relativism and know that some people might be resistant, and really hear like what's underneath that for them, where's the fear coming from, and begin to address and listen to that fear, that could be a way to move it. I think the key thing, and I really want to stress that this is the scheme of cognitive and ethical development. So please don't take these frameworks and then use them in any way to try and manipulate an outcome, because that is the unethical application of these tools and frameworks and language. The key piece is that if you're really wanting to see this change in your organization, who do you genuinely want to develop relationships with? Don't go find the person who you think if you use this tool, you could manipulate them to get the outcome that you're looking for. Find the people that you feel like yeah, we disagree, but I really want to get to know this person, and I'm willing to be vulnerable and invest in this relationship, even if we never come to agreement on this. And if you can place yourself in relationship with these people and allow yourself to be influenced by them and to understand that they may never shift, you can't enter it with an expectation of them moving, then you're using these tools in all the right ways in the right context. And it's slow. I know all of us want to wish that this had happened yesterday, but what happens when we do fast, so-called fast change, it's often change that isn't rooted and grounded in anything authentic, and it often tends to be fast losses just as quickly. So we want to make sure that we're doing steady relationship-based change where people allow themselves to be influenced by the connections that we're making with other human beings. What are the next steps if you are a target? I mean, I think that one of the key things that I would say is that we need to get more resources for ourselves so that we're having places to do our healing work, so we're not taking that upset into our activism. What does that mean? I think when I'm feeling angry and I'm asked one more time to explain something that I feel like I've explained a million times, or I'm asked to listen to hate speech in a way that feels demeaning and degrading. I need to have places where I can do that healing work and still say no in a way that keeps me connected to other human beings. This isn't about letting anything go by and not taking a principled stand. It's how do we take principled stands in ways that keep us connected to other human beings, where we don't demonize or make abnormal or make deviant people who are perhaps espousing this language that feels like such a threat, and in many cases can be a threat to us. I think this work for any of us on the target side, and I would say all of us on this webinar in some place, in some context, or on the target side, need groups where we can begin to do that work, not with people who will collude with us, like it was correct that you chewed their head off, but rather let me chew my head, get upset here, but when I go back out there, how do I come from a place of love and connection, human to human, peer to peer, because that's my value system. So I'm going to go ahead and move us to the last. We're just still taking some more questions, but if you would be willing to share one thing that you learned today that you feel like you can immediately apply to your life or work, just in a sentence or two, if we can get a few of those. I know there's a few of you still on the line. So someone wrote, awareness of your patterns of thinking, dualist, contextual relativism will help me consider my thinking and attempt to move to a committed relativism point of view, finding the curiosity to find out what's underneath the others are saying. Thank you. I think this is really beautiful. Recognizing my own dualism, that's going to be really key. Reminder that the value-based approach is in our communication. Yeah, we can never control what the other person is going to do or how they're going to respond. We can only have control over our response. So I want to leave you with this last quote. I have found it to be a beautiful guiding principle for me in this work. It's by a Mennonite named David Augsburger. And the quote is simply, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. And if we can find a way to be listened deeply to and to listen deeply to others, I believe we have an opportunity to shift our frame of reference to come from a place of the value of love as we build these just relationships and transform our society. We hope that you'll stay in touch with us. These are some of the ways to do that. We have a website here listed. Please join our mailing list. Please join us, follow us on Twitter. We'll be doing a relaunch with a new name, new logo, and new everything come January 2018. But if you're on our list, we'll make sure to keep in touch with you in the time ahead. Thank you everyone who hung in there through our technical difficulties, and we hope that you continue to get what you came looking for on the webinar today. We will be sending out a survey very shortly, and we look forward to it. Thank you for the beautiful appreciations that we're reading in our feeds here on the question and answer and in the chat menus. We hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.